A 8-year-old boy with severe burns on his arms breaks a window to carry his unconscious 4-year-old sister out of their stepfather's locked room. When a passing driver sees the bleeding children, the photos the boy took of their injuries make him call 911 immediately. The first thing Felix Whitman noticed every morning was the pain. It started as a dull throb in his arms, radiating from the patchwork of scars that decorated his skin like a roadmap of suffering. At 8 years old, he had learned to catalog pain the way other children might catalog baseball cards. This burn from 2 weeks ago, when he had accidentally dropped Vaughn's beer bottle. That one from last month, when he had tried to protect Maple from one of Vaughn's lessons. The makeshift bandages wrapped around his forearms were strips torn from an old t-shirt, carefully applied the night before when Vaughn had finally passed out in his recliner. Felix had become expert at treating his own wounds, knowing that asking for help would only result in more punishment. The cotton fabric was already stained with dried blood and the yellowish seepage that came from burns that were trying to heal in less than ideal conditions. Sunlight filtered through the torn curtains of the small bedroom he shared with his 4-year-old sister Maple, casting long shadows across the cramped space. The room held 2 twin beds pushed against opposite walls, separated by barely 3 feet of worn carpet that had once been blue, but now showed more brown than anything else. The walls were painted an institutional green that reminded Felix of the hospital where their father had died 3 years ago, though he tried not to think about that. Maple was still sleeping in her bed across from him, her small body curled into a tight ball under a threadbare blanket that had been his when he was her age. Even in sleep, she looked tense, her tiny fists clenched as if she were ready to defend herself from invisible threats. Her blonde hair, so much like their mother's used to be before it became lank and lifeless, fanned across a pillow that had seen better days. Felix could see the fading yellow bruise on her cheek, where Vaughn had backhanded her 3 days ago for crying too loudly during one of his television programs. Felix sat up carefully, testing the range of motion in his arms. The fresh bandages pulled at his skin, and he bit back a gasp of pain. He had learned long ago that making noise in the morning was dangerous. Vaughn worked the night shift at the Millbrook manufacturing plant, and he usually came home around 7 in the morning, drunk and looking for reasons to be angry. It was currently 6:15 by the broken digital clock on the windowsill, which meant Felix had about 45 minutes to get himself and Maple ready for whatever mood Vaughn would be in. The house around them was a testament to gradual decay. What had once been their family home had slowly transformed into something that felt more like a prison. The wallpaper in the hallway was peeling at the corners, and several of the floorboards creaked ominously when stepped on. The front porch sagged on one side, and the paint on the exterior had faded from white to a dingy gray that matched the overcast skies that seemed perpetual in Millbrook. Felix remembered when this house had been filled with laughter. Before their father's accident, before the bills became impossible to pay, before their mother Celeste had made the desperate decision to marry Vaughn Caldwell as a way to keep them from losing their home. That had been 18 months ago, and Felix sometimes wondered if homelessness might have been preferable to their current situation. Their father, Michael Whitman, had been a good man who worked 2 jobs to support his family. He had been driving home from his second job at the grocery store when a drunk driver ran a red light and changed everything. Felix still remembered the police officers coming to their door, still remembered his mother's scream when they told her that Daddy wasn't coming home. He remembered the funeral, where everyone said Michael was in a better place now, though Felix couldn't understand how anywhere could be better than home with his family. After the funeral, the bills had started piling up. Their father's life insurance wasn't enough to cover the mortgage and living expenses, and Celeste had struggled to find work that paid enough to support them while still being available to care for 2 young children. That's when Vaughn had appeared, like a predator sensing weakness. He had been charming at first, bringing gifts for the children and flowers for Celeste. He had promised to take care of them, to be the father that Felix and Maple needed. Felix had been skeptical from the beginning. Something about Vaughn's smile had never reached his eyes, and the man had a way of gripping Felix's shoulder just a little too tightly when he spoke to him. But Celeste had been desperate, and desperation had a way of making people ignore warning signs that should have been obvious. The first few months had been relatively peaceful. Vaughn had kept his drinking to weekends and his temper in check. He had even helped Felix with his homework and played simple games with Maple. But gradually, like a frog being slowly boiled alive, the situation had deteriorated. The drinking became more frequent, the criticism more harsh, and the punishments more severe. It started with yelling, then progressed to grabbing and shaking. The first time Vaughn had hit Felix, it had been an open-handed slap across the face for tracking mud through the house. Celeste had protested, but Vaughn had convinced her that discipline was necessary, that Felix needed a firm hand to grow up properly. By the time the hitting became regular occurrences, Celeste had become too frightened and beaten down to effectively intervene. The burns had started 6 months ago. Vaughn had been angry about something at work, and Felix had made the mistake of asking if he could watch cartoons on the television. Vaughn had grabbed a cigarette lighter and held the flame against Felix's palm, explaining that this was what happened to children who made demands instead of requests. The scar from that first burn was still visible on Felix's left hand, a reminder of the moment when their situation had crossed from bad to truly dangerous. Felix pushed aside these memories and focused on the present. Dwelling on the past wouldn't help him protect Maple, and protecting Maple was the most important thing in his world. He swung his legs over the side of his bed and stood up, his body protesting the movement. At 8 years old, he moved like an old man who had lived through too much pain. The floorboards creaked softly under his feet as he padded across the room to check on his sister. Maple was still sleeping, but her sleep was restless. She made small whimpering sounds and occasionally jerked, as if she were trying to escape from something in her dreams. Felix suspected she was reliving yesterday's lesson, when Vaughn had locked them both in the basement for 2 hours because Maple had colored outside the lines in her coloring book. The basement was Vaughn's special place, his domain where he administered what he called character-building exercises. It was a windowless room that had once been used for storage, but Vaughn had cleared it out and equipped it with various implements that he claimed were necessary for proper child rearing. There were restraints attached to the walls, tools that looked more like instruments of torture than anything related to discipline, and stains on the concrete floor that Felix tried not to think about too carefully. Felix gently shook Maple's shoulder, and she woke with a start, her blue eyes wide with fear until she recognized her brother's face. This had become their routine. She no longer woke up peacefully, but rather with the immediate alertness of someone who had learned that safety was never guaranteed. "Morning, Maple," Felix whispered, keeping his voice soft. "We need to get ready." Maple nodded without speaking. She had become increasingly quiet over the past few months, as if she instinctively understood that drawing attention to herself was dangerous. Felix helped her sit up and checked her over for any new injuries. The bruise on her cheek was healing, and there were no fresh marks that he could see. Small victories were important in their world. "Does your head still hurt?" Felix asked, remembering how Vaughn had grabbed her hair and yanked her head back when she had been too slow to clean up her crayons. Maple touched the side of her head gingerly and shook her head. "Not today," she whispered. Felix felt a surge of protective rage that he quickly suppressed. Getting angry wouldn't help anything, and it might cloud his judgment. He needed to stay calm and focused if he was going to continue protecting his sister and himself. He helped Maple get dressed, choosing clothes that would cover most of her body in case there were bruises he had missed. Long sleeves and long pants had become their standard uniform, not just for protection from Vaughn's hands, but also to hide the evidence of his discipline from the outside world. Felix had become expert at explaining away visible injuries. He was clumsy. He fell down a lot. He He was just a rough-and-tumble kid who got into scrapes. As they got ready, Felix's mind wandered to a discovery he had made 2 days ago that might change everything. He had been taking out the trash when he noticed that the Hendersons next door had thrown away what looked like a working smartphone. Mr. Henderson was notorious for upgrading his electronics frequently, and apparently he had discarded his previous phone when he got a new one. Felix had retrieved the phone from the trash, his heart pounding with the fear of being caught. He had hidden it under his mattress and waited until the middle of the night to examine it properly. The phone still had some battery life, and more importantly, it still had a working camera. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, Felix felt like he might have a weapon to fight back with. Yesterday, while Vaughn had been passed out drunk and Celeste had been grocery shopping, Felix had made a decision that terrified and empowered him in equal measure. He had taken the phone and systematically photographed his injuries and Maple's bruises. He had even managed to sneak into the basement and take pictures of Vaughn's discipline room with its restraints and implements of torture. Felix didn't fully understand what he planned to do with these photographs, but something deep in his 8-year-old mind told him they were important. Maybe someone would believe them if they could see the evidence. Maybe someone would finally help them escape this hell that their home had become. The phone was currently hidden in a loose floorboard under his bed, wrapped in an old sock to protect it from moisture. Felix checked it every night to make sure it was still there, terrified that Vaughn would somehow discover it and realize what Felix was planning. He wasn't even sure what he was planning, but having documentation of their situation made him feel less powerless. From downstairs, Felix heard the familiar sound of Vaughn's truck pulling into the driveway. The engine made a rattling noise that had gotten worse over the past few weeks, and Vaughn's mood was often influenced by mechanical problems with his vehicle. Felix grabbed Maple's hand and squeezed it gently, their signal that they needed to be extra careful. "Remember," Felix whispered to his sister, "quiet voices, careful movements, and stay close to me." Maple nodded solemnly. At 4 years old, she had learned survival skills that no child should ever need to know. They heard Vaughn's heavy footsteps on the front porch, followed by the slam of the front door. Felix could tell immediately from the way Vaughn was walking that he was drunk again. There was a particular shuffle to his gait when he had been drinking, and the sound of him bumping into furniture as he made his way through the house. "Celeste!" Vaughn's voice boomed through the house. "Where the hell is my breakfast?" Felix heard their mother's quick footsteps as she hurried to the kitchen. Celeste had learned to anticipate Vaughn's needs, but it was never quite enough. There was always something wrong, always some reason for him to be dissatisfied and angry. Felix and Maple waited in their room, listening to the muffled conversation downstairs. Felix couldn't make out the words, but he could hear the tone. Vaughn's voice getting louder and more aggressive, Celeste's voice getting smaller and more apologetic. This was how most mornings began now, with their mother trying desperately to appease a man who seemed determined to find fault with everything she did. Felix thought about his mother and felt a complicated mix of love, frustration, and pity. Celeste Whitman had once been a vibrant, protective parent who would have moved mountains to keep her children safe. She had been the one who kissed scraped knees better, who read bedtime stories with funny voices, who made every birthday feel like the most important day in the world. That woman still existed somewhere inside Celeste Whitman Caldwell, but she had been buried under layers of fear and psychological abuse. Vaughn had systematically broken down her confidence and sense of self-worth until she became a shadow of her former self. She still loved her children. Felix could see it in her eyes when she looked at them, but she had become too frightened and beaten down to effectively protect them. Felix understood, intellectually, that his mother was as much a victim as he and Maple were. But understanding didn't make it easier to watch her fail to intervene when Vaughn was hurting them. It didn't make it easier to see her look away when Felix showed up to breakfast with fresh injuries. Love and disappointment could coexist, Felix had learned, and both emotions could break your heart simultaneously. The shouting downstairs escalated, and Felix heard something crash, probably a plate or cup being thrown. Maple flinched and moved closer to her brother, seeking the comfort and protection that had become his responsibility to provide. Felix wrapped his arms around her, careful not to put pressure on his own injuries, and whispered reassurances that he hoped were true. "It's going to be okay," he told her, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. "I'll take care of you." This had become Felix's promise and his burden. At 8 years old, he had become the primary protector in their household, the one who stepped between Vaughn's anger and Maple's vulnerability. He had learned to read Vaughn's moods like a meteorologist reading storm patterns, always watching for signs that violence was approaching. Felix had developed strategies for managing their survival. He knew that Vaughn was more dangerous when he had been drinking, but also more easily distracted. He knew that taking blame for Maple's mistakes would usually redirect Vaughn's anger away from her and onto him, and he was better equipped to handle physical punishment than his 4-year-old sister. He had learned which words would escalate a situation and which might diffuse it, though with Vaughn's unpredictable nature, even the safest responses could sometimes trigger an explosion. The house fell quiet again, which could mean either that Vaughn had calmed down or that he had passed out in his chair. Felix waited several more minutes before deciding it was safe to venture downstairs. He and Maple needed to eat breakfast and then stay out of Vaughn's way for the rest of the day. "Stay close," Felix whispered to Maple as they prepared to leave their room. "If anything happens, run back up here and hide under your bed." Maple nodded again, her small face serious beyond her years. Felix took her hand and led her toward the door, both children moving with the careful silence of prey animals trying to avoid detection by a predator. As they reached the top of the stairs, Felix could see Vaughn sprawled in his recliner in the living room, already snoring loudly. Empty beer bottles littered the floor around his chair, and the television was playing some early morning talk show at a volume that would have woken the neighbors if they had been closer than 50 yards away. Felix guided Maple carefully down the stairs, avoiding the steps that creaked. In the kitchen, they found their mother cleaning up the remains of what had apparently been a plate that hadn't survived Vaughn's tantrum. Celeste looked up when they entered, and Felix saw the familiar combination of love and defeat in her eyes. "Good morning, babies," Celeste said softly, trying to smile but not quite managing it. "Are you hungry?" Felix nodded and helped Maple into her chair at the kitchen table. The chair was an old wooden one that wobbled slightly, but it was better than the plastic lawn chair they had used before Vaughn had thrown that one out the back door during a rage 3 weeks ago. Celeste moved around the kitchen with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to be as quiet as possible while still accomplishing necessary tasks. She prepared simple breakfasts for the children, toast with a thin layer of peanut butter and glasses of milk that Felix suspected was close to its expiration date based on the slightly sour smell. As they ate, Felix studied his mother's face and noted the new bruises around her wrist that she was trying to hide with long sleeves. Vaughn's violence wasn't limited to the children, though he seemed to take particular pleasure in hurting Felix, who represented a challenge to his authority. "In the household, Mama," Maple said quietly. "When is Daddy coming home?" The question hit Celeste like a physical blow, and Felix saw tears spring to her eyes before she quickly turned away to hide them. Maple still sometimes forgot that their real father wasn't coming back, and these innocent questions were like salt in wounds that hadn't properly healed. "Daddy isn't coming home, sweetie," Celeste said gently, her voice thick with emotion. "Remember? We talked about how Daddy is in heaven now." Maple's face fell, and Felix reached over to squeeze her hand. He remembered when Maple used to ask this question daily, and how each repetition had seemed to break their mother's heart a little more. The frequency had decreased as Maple's memory of their father faded, but the question still surfaced occasionally, usually when she was feeling particularly vulnerable. Felix finished his toast and helped Maple with hers, making sure she ate every bite. Good nutrition was important for healing, and both children needed all the strength they could get. He also knew that leaving food on plates could trigger Vaughn's anger if he woke up and decided that the children were being wasteful or ungrateful. After breakfast, Felix and Maple retreated to their room while Celeste began the daily routine of cleaning the house to Vaughn's impossible standards. Felix helped Maple with a simple coloring book while keeping one ear tuned for sounds from downstairs. Vaughn's snoring had stopped, which meant he might be waking up, and a hungover Vaughn was often even more dangerous than a drunk one. Felix thought about the phone hidden under his bed and wondered if today might be the day he would need to use it. He didn't have a clear plan for what he would do with the photographs he had taken, but having them made him feel slightly less helpless. For the first time in months, he had evidence of what was happening to them, proof that might make someone believe their story if they ever got the chance to tell it. The morning stretched on with the familiar tension that had become their normal. Felix and Maple played quiet games, spoke in whispers, and moved through their own home like guests who were afraid of overstaying their welcome. This was their reality now, a constant state of hypervigilance, always waiting for the next explosion of violence, always ready to protect each other as best they could. Felix looked at his sister's innocent face as she carefully colored within the lines of her coloring book, determined not to repeat yesterday's mistake that had led to their punishment. At 4 years old, Maple was already learning that perfection was the only acceptable standard, that any mistake could result in pain and terror. This wasn't the childhood Felix had imagined for either of them. He remembered when they used to play loudly, laugh freely, and feel safe in their own home. Those days felt like memories from someone else's life now, distant and almost unreal compared to their current existence. But Felix held on to hope, even when it seemed foolish to do. So, he held on to the belief that somehow, someday, someone would help them escape this nightmare. He held on to the photographs hidden under his bed like a secret weapon, evidence that might eventually set them free. As the morning sun climbed higher, in the sky, Felix wrapped his arms more securely around his sister and promised himself that he would continue to protect her, no matter what Vaughn did to them. He was only 8 years old, but he had already learned that love sometimes meant putting someone else's safety before your own, and that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but rather the decision to act, despite being afraid. The house remained quiet for now, but Felix knew it was only temporary. Vaughn would wake up eventually, and when he did, their real test of survival would begin again. But for this moment, in the pale morning light filtering through their torn curtains, Felix allowed himself to imagine a different future, one where he and Maple could be children again, where their mother could smile without fear, where home meant safety instead of danger. It was a beautiful dream, and Felix held onto it as tightly as he held onto his sister, knowing that hope might be the only thing that could carry them through whatever came next. The rest of the morning passed in the fragile peace that Felix had learned to recognize as temporary. Vaughn remained unconscious in his recliner, surrounded by the detritus of his latest drinking session, while Celeste moved through the house like a ghost, trying not to disturb the living. Felix and Maple stayed in their room, playing quiet games and speaking in whispers that had become their normal volume of communication. By early afternoon, the smell of cooking food began to drift upstairs, signaling that Celeste was preparing what would serve as both lunch and an early dinner. Vaughn's schedule meant that mealtimes in their house followed no normal pattern. They ate when he was hungry, slept when he allowed it, and lived according to the unpredictable rhythms of his moods and work schedule. Felix heard Vaughn stirring downstairs around 3 o'clock, the familiar sounds of him waking up hungover and angry. There was the crash of beer bottles being knocked over, followed by a string of profanity that made Felix automatically cover Maple's ears. Vaughn's hangovers were legendary in their household. He woke up feeling like his head was splitting. His stomach was churning, and the entire world was conspiring against him. "Celeste!" Vaughn's voice boomed through the house, rough with sleep and alcohol abuse. "What the hell time is it? Why didn't you wake me up?" Felix heard his mother's quick footsteps, as she hurried to explain that Vaughn had specifically told her not to wake him, that he had said he needed to sleep off his night shift. But logic and Vaughn's memory were rarely aligned when he was hungover, and he seemed to take personal offense at any reminder of his own instructions. "Don't give me excuses," Vaughn snarled. "I've got things to do today, and now half the day is gone because you couldn't be bothered to wake me up like a decent wife." "Should." Felix winced at the sound of something being thrown, followed by Celeste's small cry of pain or surprise. He automatically moved closer to Maple, ready to shield her if Vaughn's anger found its way upstairs. But for now, their mother seemed to be bearing the brunt of his bad mood. The afternoon stretched on with the familiar pattern of escalating tension. Vaughn's voice grew louder and more aggressive as he moved through the house, finding fault with everything from the way Celeste had folded his work clothes to the fact that there wasn't enough beer in the refrigerator. Each complaint was delivered, with the kind of venom that suggested personal betrayal rather than minor domestic issues. Felix knew from experience that days like this often built toward an explosion. Vaughn's anger was like pressure building in a steam engine. It had to go somewhere eventually, and when it did, someone was going to get hurt. Felix just hoped that someone would be him rather than Maple or their mother. Around 5 o'clock, Celeste called them down for dinner. Felix helped Maple wash her hands in the small bathroom they shared, checking to make sure there were no visible marks on either of them that might trigger Vaughn's attention. Sometimes bruises that were fading would catch his eye and remind him of previous lessons that he felt needed reinforcing. The kitchen table was set for 4, though Vaughn's place setting looked like it belonged to a different meal entirely. While Felix, Maple, and Celeste had simple plates with modest portions, Vaughn's spot featured a large plate piled high with food, multiple beer bottles already opened and waiting, and the expectation that he would be served first and best. Vaughn was already seated when they entered the kitchen, his hair still messy from sleep, and his face bearing the puffy, red-eyed look of someone who had consumed far too much alcohol the night before. He was wearing a stained undershirt and the same jeans he had been wearing for 3 days, and the smell of stale beer and unwashed body emanated from his general direction. "About time," he muttered, as Felix helped Maple into her chair. "I've been waiting here for 10 minutes. Felix bit back the observation that Vaughn had only just sat down, having learned that correcting Vaughn's version of events was always a mistake. Instead, he focused on making sure Maple was settled properly in her chair, and that her napkin was spread across her lap the way Vaughn insisted it should be. Celeste served Vaughn first, her hands shaking slightly as she placed his plate in front of him. Felix could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she was trying to anticipate his complaints before he could voice them. She had become an expert at reading his moods, though her accuracy in predicting his reactions had not improved. Her ability to avoid his anger. "This meat is overcooked," Vaughn announced after taking his first bite, though Felix could see that it looked perfectly normal. "How many times do I have to tell you how I like my food prepared?" "I'm sorry," Celeste said quietly. "I can make you something else if you'd like." "Don't bother," Vaughn said, taking a long pull from his beer. "I'll eat it, but I'm not happy about it. A man works hard all night, and he shouldn't have to come home to ruined food." Felix focused on cutting Maple's food into small pieces, trying to make himself invisible while still being helpful to his sister. The key to surviving meals with Vaughn was to be present enough to avoid being accused of rudeness, but not so present that you drew unwanted attention. Maple was eating carefully, taking small bites and chewing thoroughly before swallowing. She had learned, through painful experience, that eating too quickly or too messily could result in consequences that went far beyond simple table manner corrections. Every movement she made was deliberate and cautious, the behavior of a child who had learned that perfection was the only acceptable standard. For a few minutes, the meal proceeded in relative quiet. Vaughn complained intermittently about the food, the temperature of his beer, and the noise coming from the neighbors' children, playing outside, but his complaints remained verbal rather than escalating to physical consequences. Felix began to hope that they might make it through dinner without incident. Then Maple reached for her glass of milk. It was such a simple movement, the kind of thing that any 4-year-old might do hundreds of times without consequence. But as Maple stretched her small arm across the table, her elbow bumped her glass, sending it tipping over and spilling milk across the table surface and onto the floor. The silence that followed was deafening. Felix's heart immediately began racing as he saw Vaughn's face transform from annoyed to furious in the space of a heartbeat. Maple stared at the spreading puddle of milk with a kind of horror that suggested she understood exactly what she had just triggered. "You clumsy little brat," Vaughn said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Look what you've done." "It was an accident," Felix said quickly, jumping up to grab a towel. "I'll clean it up right away." "Sit down," Vaughn snapped, his eyes never leaving Maple's terrified face. "She made the mess. She needs to learn from it." Felix remained standing, the towel in his hands, torn between his desire to clean up the spill and his understanding that Vaughn was using this incident as an excuse for something far worse than a simple cleanup. Celeste had frozen in her chair, her face pale with the recognition of what was about to happen. "I'm sorry," Maple whispered, tears beginning to well up in her eyes. "I didn't mean to." "You didn't mean to," Vaughn repeated mockingly. "That's what you always say, isn't it? Everything is always an accident with you. Maybe it's time you learned to be more careful." Vaughn stood up from his chair with the deliberate slowness of someone who was savoring the moment. Felix knew this behavior pattern. Vaughn liked to draw out the anticipation, to let fear build before he acted. It was part of the psychological torture that he seemed to enjoy as much as the physical violence. "Please," Celeste said quietly. "She's just a little girl. It really was an accident." "Shut up," Vaughn said without even looking at her. "This is exactly the problem. You make excuses for them instead of teaching them proper behavior." "Well, I'm going to teach them something they'll remember." Felix stepped forward, positioning himself between Vaughn and Maple. "I'll take her." "Punishment," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "It's my fault for not watching her more carefully." Vaughn smiled at this, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "Oh, you'll both learn something today. But she needs to understand that actions have consequences." Felix watched in horror as Vaughn walked over to the kitchen stove and turned on one of the gas burners. The blue flame sprang to life, and Vaughn reached into a drawer to pull out a metal spatula with a long handle. Felix's stomach dropped as he realized what Vaughn was planning to do. "No," Felix said, moving to put himself completely between Vaughn and Maple. "Please don't hurt her. I'll take whatever punishment you want, but don't hurt her." Vaughn held the metal spatula over the flame, watching as the metal began to heat up. "You know what your problem is, Felix? You think you're the parent in this house. You think you get to make decisions about discipline and consequences, but you're just a kid, and kids need to learn their place." Felix could feel the heat radiating from the burner even from several feet away. He had experienced Vaughn's heated metal punishments before, and the memory of that searing pain made his existing scars throb sympathetically. But the thought of Maple experiencing that same agony was unbearable. "She's only 4, Felix pleaded. "She doesn't understand. Please, just punish me instead." "Oh, I'll get to you," Vaughn said, testing the heat of the spatula by holding it close to his own hand. "But first, little Miss Clumsy here needs to learn to be more careful with other people's property." Maple began to cry in earnest now, the kind of desperate sobbing that came from a child who understood that something terrible was about to happen, but was powerless to stop it. She looked at Felix with complete trust, believing that somehow her big brother would find a way to protect her as he always had before. Felix's mind raced, trying to find some way to prevent what was about to happen. He could throw himself at Vaughn, but that would only delay the inevitable and probably make the punishment worse. He could try to grab Maple and run, but Vaughn was blocking the kitchen exit and there was nowhere to go in their small house, That would provide real safety. Vaughn, please, Celeste said, standing up from her chair. She's just a baby. Can't you see she's scared? Vaughn turned to look at his wife with an expression of pure contempt. Sit down and shut up, or you'll be next. I'm tired of living in a house where nobody respects my authority. Today that changes. The spatula was glowing red-hot now, and Vaughn turned his attention back to Maple. Come here, little girl. It's time you learned what happens when you don't take care of other people's things. No! Felix shouted, throwing himself forward to grab Maple and pull her away from the table. But Vaughn had anticipated this move, and he grabbed Felix's arm with his free hand, his grip like a vice. I told you to wait your turn, Vaughn snarled, and before Felix could react, Vaughn pressed the heated spatula against Felix's forearm, right over some of his existing scars. The pain was indescribable. Felix screamed despite his determination to stay quiet, the sound torn from his throat by agony so intense that his vision went white around the edges. The smell of burning flesh filled the kitchen, and Felix could hear Maple's terrified crying and Celeste's shocked gasp, as if they were coming from very far away. Vaughn held the spatula against Felix's arm for what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds. When he finally pulled it away, Felix collapsed to his knees, cradling his arm against his chest and trying not to vomit from the pain. That's for interfering, Vaughn said calmly, as if he had just delivered a minor correction rather than inflicting serious bodily harm. Now, it's her turn. But Maple, seeing her brother's agony, did something that surprised everyone in the room. Instead of cowering or trying to run, she launched herself at Vaughn with all the fury that a 4-year-old could muster. She hit his legs with her small fists, kicked at his shins, and screamed at him to leave her brother alone. You're mean, she shouted through her tears. You're mean and I hate you. Don't hurt Felix anymore. For a moment, everyone in the kitchen was frozen by the sight of tiny Maple attacking a man who outweighed her by more than 200 pounds. It was brave and futile and heartbreaking all at the same time. Then Vaughn's face twisted with rage. You little bitch, he snarled, and he backhanded Maple across the face with enough force to send her small body flying across the kitchen. Maple hit the wall with a sickening thud and crumpled to the floor. For a moment, she didn't move at all, and Felix felt his heart stop with terror. Then she began to cry again, but it was a different kind of crying, weaker, more confused, with an undertone that suggested something was seriously wrong. Maple! Felix tried to get up to go to her, but Vaughn grabbed him by the hair and hauled him back. She's not done learning yet, Vaughn said, his voice thick with alcohol and rage. And neither are you. What happened next unfolded with the kind of horrible clarity that trauma victims often describe. Every detail crystal clear, every moment stretched out like a nightmare that refuses to end. Vaughn dragged Maple up from the floor, and Felix could see that she was barely conscious, her eyes unfocused and a thin trickle of blood running from her ear. Look what you made me do, Vaughn said to Felix, as if the violence had been Felix's fault rather than his own choice. Now she's really hurt, and it's because you couldn't mind your own business. Felix tried to speak, tried to beg Vaughn to get medical help for Maple, but his throat felt like it had closed up completely. The burn on his arm was still screaming with pain, but all of his attention was focused on his sister's condition. The blood from her ear was a bad sign. Felix didn't know much about medical issues, but he knew that head injuries were serious. Vaughn looked at both children with disgust, as if their injuries were personal affronts to him rather than the direct results of his own actions. Maybe sometime in the thinking room will help you both remember how to behave properly, he said. The thinking room was what Vaughn called the basement space that he had converted into his personal torture chamber. Felix had been there many times before, but never with Maple injured like this, never when time was so critical. He tried to struggle as Vaughn dragged them both toward the basement door, but his injured arm made resistance nearly impossible. The basement stairs were steep and wooden, and Vaughn showed no care for the children's safety as he forced them down into the windowless space below. The room smelled of damp concrete, fear, and old pain. The walls were lined with various implements that Vaughn used for what he called behavior modification, restraints, tools for inflicting pain, and surfaces stained with evidence of previous sessions. There was only one small window in the IHOP room, set high up near the ceiling and barely large enough for a child to fit through. It was the kind of window that was meant for ventilation rather than escape, and it was currently closed and locked from the outside. Vaughn shoved both children into the center of the room and looked down at them with satisfaction. Felix was still cradling his burned arm, and Maple was barely conscious, swaying where she sat and making small, whimpering sounds that suggested she was in significant pain. "You can stay down here until you learn some respect," Vaughn announced. "Maybe a few hours in the dark will help you think about your behavior." "She needs a doctor," Felix managed to say through his pain. "Please, she hit her head really hard," Vaughn laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor or compassion. "She needs to learn not to attack adults who are trying to teach her proper behavior. A headache is good for character building." With that, Vaughn turned and walked back up the stairs, and Felix heard the heavy door slam shut, followed by the sound of a deadbolt being engaged. They were trapped in the basement with no way out. Maple was seriously injured, and Vaughn had made it clear that he had no intention of providing medical care. Felix crawled over to where Maple was sitting and gently took her in his arms. She was conscious but confused, her eyes having trouble focusing on his face. The blood from her ear had increased, and Felix was terrified that she might have suffered a brain injury when her head hit the wall. "Maple, can you hear me?" Felix whispered, trying to keep his voice calm despite his terror. "Felix?" Maple's voice was small and weak. "My head hurts really bad." "I know, sweetheart. I'm going to take care of you, okay? We're going to be fine. But..." Even as Felix said the words, he wasn't sure he believed them. They were locked in a windowless basement, both of them injured, with no way to call for help, and no realistic expectation that anyone would come looking for them. Vaughn often left them in the basement for hours at a time, and with his unpredictable work schedule, it could be morning before he even remembered they were down there. Felix looked around the basement room, his mind racing despite his pain. The small window near the ceiling was their only possible means of escape, but it was at least 8 feet off the ground and barely large enough for a child to squeeze through. Even if he could somehow reach it and break the glass, he wasn't sure he could fit through the opening while carrying Maple. But as he looked at his sister's pale face and unfocused eyes, Felix realized that conventional escape might not be their only option. Hidden upstairs in his bedroom was the smartphone with the photographs he had taken of their injuries and Vaughn's torture implements. If he could somehow get to that phone, if he could somehow get outside where there might be cell phone service, he might be able to call for help. The idea was terrifying and probably impossible, but it was the only hope they had. Felix couldn't carry Maple up 8 feet to reach the window, but he might be able to lift her high enough to push her through if he could stack some of the furniture in the room. And once she was outside, he could follow and then retrieve the phone from his hiding place. It was a desperate plan with dozens of ways it could go wrong, but as Felix felt Maple's small body growing more limp in his arms, he realized that doing nothing was not an option. Vaughn's violence had finally crossed the line from abuse to potentially life-threatening assault, and Felix's protective instincts overrode his fear of the consequences. Felix looked up at the small window and began to plan their escape. He had perhaps an hour before Vaughn would return from his evening drinking ritual, maybe less if Vaughn decided to check on them sooner. The window was small, the drop to the ground outside was significant, and both children were injured. But sometimes impossible odds were better than no odds at all. "Maple," Felix whispered to his sister, "I need you to stay awake, okay? We're going to get out of here, but I need you to be brave for just a little while longer." Maple nodded weakly, and Felix felt a surge of determination that surprised him with its intensity. He was 8 years old, trapped in a basement, seriously injured, and responsible for saving both his own life and his sister's. But he had documented evidence of their abuse, he had a plan for escape, and he had something that Vaughn would never understand, the kind of love that makes ordinary people capable of extraordinary things. Felix began to move furniture toward the wall beneath the window, each movement sending fire through his burned arm but bringing him one step closer to their freedom. Tonight, one way or another, this nightmare was going to end. The basement felt like a tomb in the darkness that followed Vaughn's departure. The only light came from a thin sliver seeping under the door at the top of the stairs, barely enough to make out shapes in the windowless room. Felix held Maple close to his chest, feeling her small body trembling against him, while his own arm screamed with pain from the fresh burn that Vaughn had inflicted. The smell of the basement was overwhelming, damp concrete mixed with the metallic scent of old blood and the acrid odor of fear that seemed to have soaked into the very walls. This room had witnessed too much suffering, had absorbed too many screams and tears, and Felix could feel the weight of all that accumulated pain pressing down on them like a physical presence. Maple's breathing was shallow and irregular, and every few minutes she would make a small whimpering sound that cut through Felix like a knife. The blood from her ear had continued to seep, creating a dark stain on Felix's shirt where her head rested against his shoulder. He knew enough about head injuries from health classes at school to understand that blood from the ear was a serious warning sign, potentially indicating brain damage or internal bleeding. "Maple," Felix whispered, gently shaking his sister to keep her conscious. "Talk to me, sweetheart. Tell me about your favorite color." "Blue," Maple responded weakly, her voice slurred and confused. Like Daddy's eyes were blue." Felix's heart clenched at the mention of their father. Maple's memories of their real father were becoming increasingly hazy as time passed, replaced by the nightmare reality of life with Vaughn. But in moments of vulnerability like this, she still reached for those older, safer memories. "That's right," Felix said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Daddy had blue eyes, just like yours. What else do you remember about Daddy?" He used to read me stories," Maple said, her words coming slower now. "And he made funny voices for all the animals." Felix felt tears burning his eyes, but he blinked them back. He couldn't afford to break down now, not when Maple needed him to be strong. But the contrast between their father's gentle bedtime stories and their current situation in Vaughn's torture chamber was almost too painful to bear. As the minutes ticked by, Felix became increasingly aware that time was working against them. Vaughn had left for what he called his evening constitutional, a drinking session at Murphy's bar that usually lasted 2 to 3 hours. But Vaughn's schedule was unpredictable, especially when he was angry, and there was no guarantee that he wouldn't return early to continue their lesson. More importantly, Maple's condition seemed to be deteriorating. Her responses to Felix's questions were becoming weaker and more confused, and he was terrified that she might lose consciousness entirely. If she had suffered serious brain trauma, from hitting the wall, every minute that passed without medical attention could be critical. Felix forced himself to take inventory of their situation with the methodical approach that had kept them alive this long. The basement room was approximately 12 feet by 8 feet, with concrete walls on 3 sides and the wooden foundation wall of the house on the 4th side. The ceiling was low, maybe 7 feet high, with exposed wooden beams that supported the floor above. The furniture in the room consisted of Vaughn's discipline implements, a wooden chair with restraints attached to the arms, a table covered with various tools designed to inflict pain, and several boxes that contained additional equipment for what Vaughn called behavior modification sessions. The sight of these implements filled Felix with rage and determination in equal measure. The window that represented their only hope of escape was set high in the foundation wall, approximately 8 feet from the floor. It was one of those small basement windows designed for ventilation rather than access, maybe 18 inches wide and 12 inches tall. The glass was thick and reinforced with wire mesh, and Felix could see that it was currently latched shut from the outside. Felix had been in this room many times before, but always as a victim brought here for punishment. He had never examined it with the eye of someone planning an escape. Now, as he studied every detail, he began to formulate a plan that was dangerous, probably impossible, but their only realistic chance of survival. The first challenge was reaching the window. Felix estimated that he would need to stack furniture to create a platform at least 6 feet high, which would allow him to reach the window frame and work on opening it. The wooden chair was sturdy enough to support weight, and if he could somehow get it on top of Vaughn's table, he might be able to create a makeshift ladder. The second challenge was breaking through the window itself. The glass was reinforced, and the frame was old and probably painted shut. Felix would need something heavy enough to break the glass without making so much noise that it would alert Vaughn if he was still in the house. Looking around the room, he spotted a metal tool that Vaughn used for his sessions, a heavy implement that would serve as an effective hammer. The third and most difficult challenge was getting both himself and Maple through the window and safely to the ground outside. The window was barely large enough for a child, and the drop to the outside ground level was at least 4 feet. With Maple injured and potentially unconscious, Felix would have to find a way to lift her to the window level and then lower her safely to the ground before following himself. But even if they managed to escape the basement, Felix knew their ordeal would not be over. They would be outside in the cold night air, both injured and bleeding, with nowhere to go and no immediate way to call for help. The nearest neighbor was almost 100 yards away, and Felix wasn't sure he could carry Maple that far in his current condition. That's when Felix remembered the smartphone hidden under his mattress upstairs. If he could somehow get back into the house after escaping the basement, he could retrieve the phone and the crucial photographs that documented their abuse. With that evidence, he might be able to convince someone to help them, to finally make someone believe what Vaughn had been doing to them. The plan was forming in Felix's mind with increasing clarity, despite the pain from his burned arm and his fear for Maple's deteriorating condition. He would stack the furniture to reach the window, break through the glass, get Maple to safety outside, then return to retrieve the phone and evidence. It was dangerous and complicated, but it was better than waiting in the basement for Vaughn to return and possibly finish what he had started. Felix gently shifted Maple's position so he could examine their surroundings more carefully. The wooden chair that Vaughn used for restraining victims was heavy, but movable. The table was larger and more awkward, but if Felix could clear off the tools and equipment, he might be able to drag it across the room to position it under the window. "Maple," Felix whispered, trying to rouse his sister to consciousness. "I need you to stay awake, okay? We're going to get out of here, but I need you to help me." Maple's eyes fluttered open, but her gaze was unfocused and confused. "Felix, where are we?" "We're in the basement, but we're going to leave soon. I'm going to stack some furniture so we can reach the window, and then we're going to climb out. And get help." Maple nodded weakly, though Felix wasn't sure she fully understood what he was saying. Her cognitive function seemed to be declining, which made their escape even more urgent. Felix knew that with serious head injuries, the window for effective medical intervention was often measured in hours rather than days. Felix began the physically demanding task of moving furniture while trying to minimize noise. Every movement sent fire through his burned arm, and the smell of his own charred flesh made his stomach churn. But he pushed through the pain, driven by the knowledge that Maple's life might depend on his actions in the next hour. The table was heavier than he had anticipated, and dragging it across the concrete floor created a scraping sound that seemed impossibly loud in the confined space. Felix paused frequently to listen for any indication that Vaughn had heard the noise and was coming to investigate. But the house above remained silent, suggesting that Vaughn had indeed left for his evening drinking session. Once Felix had positioned the table under the window, he faced the challenge of getting the chair on top of it. The chair was awkward and heavy, and lifting it above his head while dealing with his injured arm was nearly impossible. But Felix discovered that by climbing onto the table first, he could drag the chair up after him, creating a makeshift platform. that brought him within reach of the window. Standing on the chair on top of the table, Felix could finally examine the window mechanism up close. The frame was old and painted multiple times, with layers of paint sealing the latch mechanism. But more challenging was the wire mesh that had been installed over the glass, apparently to prevent exactly the kind of escape that Felix was attempting. Felix selected the heaviest tool from Vaughn's collection, a metal implement that looked like a modified hammer designed for inflicting pain rather than building anything constructive. The irony was not lost on him that he was using Vaughn's own torture devices as tools for their liberation. The first blow against the window frame created a sound that seemed to echo through the entire house. Felix froze, listening for any indication that the noise had attracted attention. When no response came, he continued working, using the metal tool to chip away at the paint and corrosion that held the latch mechanism frozen in place. Working in the dim light was challenging, and Felix had to rely more on touch than sight to understand how the window mechanism functioned. His hands were shaking from a combination of pain, fear, and adrenaline, making precise movements difficult. But gradually, he began to make progress, loosening the paint and corrosion that had sealed the window shut. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, Felix managed to work the latch free. The window frame creaked open, revealing the wire mesh that still blocked their escape route. The mesh was secured with screws that had rusted over time, but it represented yet another obstacle between them and freedom. Felix used the metal tool to attack the screws holding the wire mesh in place. Some of them were so corroded that they crumbled under pressure, while others required patient work to loosen and remove. Each screw that came free brought them closer to escape, but also created noise that might alert anyone in the house above. Meanwhile, Maple's condition continued to deteriorate. She had stopped responding to Felix's attempts at conversation, and her breathing had become more labored and irregular. Felix knew that they were running out of time, that every minute spent working on the window was a minute that Maple's brain injury went untreated. Finally, after removing enough screws to create an opening large enough for a child to pass through, Felix faced the moment he had been dreading. The window was open, the mesh was partially removed, but the opening was barely large enough for Maple's small body, and the drop to the ground outside was significant. Felix climbed back down to where Maple was lying and gathered her gently in his arms. She was barely conscious now, her head lolling against his shoulder in a way that terrified him. But he had come too far to stop now, and the alternative to escape was almost certainly death for both of them. Carrying Maple while climbing back onto the makeshift platform was the most difficult physical challenge Felix had ever faced. His burned arm screamed with agony, his legs shook with exhaustion, and Maple's dead weight made every movement a struggle. But love and desperation gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. Standing on the chair with Maple in his arms, Felix could see through the window to the outside world for the first time in hours. The night was dark and cold, with a thin layer of frost visible on the ground, but it represented freedom and hope in a way that made Felix's heart race with anticipation. The next challenge was getting Maple through the window opening without dropping her or causing additional injury. Felix had to position her carefully, supporting her head and neck while maneuvering her small body through the narrow opening. The wire mesh that remained caught on her clothing, and Felix had to work carefully to free her without causing cuts. Finally, Maple was through the window, and Felix faced the terrifying task of lowering her to the ground outside. The drop was about 4 feet, significant enough to cause serious injury if she landed wrong. Felix held onto her hands and lowered her as far as his arms could reach, then had to let go and hope that she would land safely. Maple hit the ground with a soft thud and immediately began crying, a sound that was simultaneously heartbreaking and reassuring since it meant she was still conscious and responsive. Felix called down to her in a whisper, telling her to stay where she was while he climbed through the window himself. Getting his own body through the narrow window opening proved to be even more challenging than helping Maple. Felix was larger and had to contort his body in uncomfortable ways to fit through the space. The jagged edges of the broken wire mesh caught on his clothing and skin, creating new cuts and scrapes that added to his growing collection of injuries. The drop to the ground jarred every injury Felix had sustained, sending fresh waves of pain through his burned arm and the cuts from the wire mesh. But he was outside, breathing free air for the first time in hours, and Maple was alive beside him. They had successfully escaped from Vaughn's basement prison, but Felix knew their ordeal was far from over. They were both injured. It was the middle of a cold night, and they had no immediate shelter or help available. Most importantly, Felix knew that the smartphone with the photographic evidence was still hidden in his bedroom upstairs. Without that evidence, even if they found help, it would be their word against Vaughn's, and adults had consistently failed to believe them in the past. Felix made a decision that was either brilliant or completely insane. While Maple was conscious and relatively stable, he would attempt to re-enter the house through a different route and retrieve the phone and evidence. It was dangerous. Vaughn might return at any moment, and Felix would be vulnerable while inside the house. But without the photographs, their escape might be meaningless. "Maple," Felix whispered, kneeling beside his sister in the cold grass outside the basement window. "I need to go back inside for a minute to get something very important. Can you wait here for me?" Maple's eyes were more focused now that they were outside, though she was shivering from cold and shock. "Don't leave me, Felix," she pleaded. "I'll only be gone for a few minutes," Felix promised. "I need to get the pictures that will help people believe us about what Vaughn has been doing. Without those pictures, no one will help us." Felix helped. Maple moved to a position where she was partially hidden behind some overgrown bushes near the foundation of the house. The location provided some shelter from the wind and concealed her from casual observation, while still allowing Felix to find her quickly when he returned. Re-entering the house proved easier than Felix had anticipated. Vaughn habitually left the back door unlocked when he went drinking, apparently confident that his victims were securely locked in the basement. Felix slipped inside quietly, his heart pounding with the knowledge that discovery would mean certain death for both himself and Maple. The house felt different now that Felix was moving through it as an escapee rather than a victim. Every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified. Every shadow seemed to hide potential danger. But Felix moved with the stealth that months of avoiding Vaughn's attention had taught him, making his way carefully up the stairs toward his bedroom. The smartphone was exactly where Felix had left it, wrapped in an old sock and hidden in the loose floorboard under his bed. As his fingers closed around the device, Felix felt a surge of hope that was almost overwhelming. This phone contained the evidence that could finally end their nightmare, proof that might convince adults to take action and protect them from further harm. But as Felix prepared to leave the bedroom, he heard the unmistakable sound of Vaughn's truck pulling into the driveway. Felix's blood turned to ice as he realized that Vaughn had returned much earlier than expected, and Felix was now trapped inside the house with a man who would certainly kill him if he was discovered. Felix had perhaps 30 seconds before Vaughn would enter the house and potentially discover that his prisoners had escaped. There was no time to return to the basement and pretend they had never left. No time to reach the back door without being seen. Felix's only option was to hide in the house and wait for an opportunity to escape, hoping that Vaughn wouldn't immediately check the basement. Felix quickly concealed himself in the bedroom closet, clutching the smartphone with the precious evidence and listening to Vaughn's footsteps as he entered the house below. Through the thin walls, Felix could hear Vaughn moving around the kitchen, apparently making himself another drink before checking on his prisoners. The next few minutes were among the most terrifying of Felix's life. He crouched in the dark closet, barely breathing, while Vaughn moved around the house below. Every sound seemed amplified: the clink of ice in a glass, the scrape of a chair across the floor, the heavy footsteps of a man who had no idea that his victims had escaped. Finally, Felix heard the basement door open and Vaughn's footsteps on the wooden stairs. Within seconds, they would be shouting in rage when Vaughn discovered the empty basement room and the evidence of their escape. Felix had perhaps 1 minute to get out of the house before Vaughn began a systematic search. Felix slipped out of the closet and moved as quickly and quietly as possible toward the stairs. Behind him, he could hear Vaughn's voice rising in anger, as he discovered the empty basement and the furniture that had been moved to facilitate their escape. The sound of fury in Vaughn's voice was terrifying, but it also meant that Felix's presence in the house had not yet been discovered. Felix reached the back door just as Vaughn's footsteps began pounding back up the basement stairs. There was no time for stealth now. Felix burst through the door and ran toward the bushes where he had left Maple, clutching the smartphone and praying that his sister was still conscious and able to move. Maple was exactly where Felix had left her, though she was now shivering violently from cold and shock. Felix gathered her in his arms and began moving away from the house, knowing that Vaughn would soon discover their escape route and begin searching the immediate area. "Come on, Maple," Felix whispered urgently. "We have to go find help now." Behind them, the house erupted with the sounds of Vaughn's rage. Felix could hear furniture being thrown around, doors slamming, and a string of profanity that would have been shocking if Felix hadn't been living with it for months. But more importantly, Felix could hear Vaughn moving toward the back of the house, presumably to check the basement window and confirm his suspicions about their escape route. Felix and Maple moved as quickly as Maple's condition would allow, staying in the shadows and avoiding the areas where Vaughn might spot them. Felix's plan was to reach the road and flag down the first car that passed, using the smartphone and its photographic evidence to convince someone to call for help. But as they reached the edge of their property, Felix realized that Maple was no longer able to walk on her own. The adrenaline that had sustained her during their escape was wearing off, and her head injury was making her increasingly disoriented and weak. Felix would have to carry her, and he wasn't sure his own injured body was capable of that level of exertion. The road in front of their house was typically quiet, especially late at night. Felix knew that they might have to wait a long time for a car to pass, and Vaughn would certainly expand his search to include the road once he confirmed that they had left the immediate area of the house. As if summoned by Felix's desperation, headlights appeared in the distance, moving slowly down their rural road. Felix's heart leaped with hope, but he also realized that this might be their only chance to get help. If this driver refused to stop or didn't believe their story, they might not get another opportunity. Felix gathered his courage and stepped into the road, waving his arms and calling for help. The car, an older sedan driven by a middle-aged man, slowed down and pulled over. Felix could see the driver's shock and horror as he took in the sight of two injured children covered in blood and standing on a dark road in the middle of the night. "Please help us," Felix called out, his voice breaking with exhaustion and desperation. "My stepfather has been hurting us, and my sister needs a doctor." The driver, who would later identify himself as Donovan Hayes, immediately got out of his car and knelt down to examine the children. Felix could see the man's genuine concern and compassion, and for the first time in months, he felt like an adult was actually seeing them and believing what they were saying. "My God," Donovan said, taking in their injuries and obvious distress. "What happened to you?" Felix pulled out the smartphone with shaking hands and showed Donovan the photographs he had taken, images of their systematic abuse, the basement torture chamber, and the implements that Vaughn used to inflict pain. The photos told a story that no words could adequately convey, evidence of suffering that was impossible to deny or explain away. Donovan's face went white as he scrolled through the images, understanding immediately that he was looking at documentation of serious criminal abuse. Without hesitation, he pulled out his own phone and dialed 911, giving their location and requesting immediate medical assistance and police response. As they waited for help to arrive, Donovan wrapped both children in blankets from his car and did his best to provide first aid for their injuries. Felix felt a sense of relief so overwhelming that he nearly collapsed. After months of being invisible to the adults who should have protected them, someone had finally seen their truth and was taking action to help them. In the distance, Felix could see lights coming on in their house as Vaughn continued his search. But Felix was no longer afraid of being found. They were under the protection of an adult who believed them. Help was on the way, and the evidence that would finally bring Vaughn to justice was safely in the hands of someone who would make sure it reached the right people. The nightmare was not over yet. There would be hospitals and police interviews and legal proceedings ahead. But for the first time in months, Felix allowed himself to believe that he and Maple might actually survive this ordeal and find their way to safety and healing. As the sound of sirens grew louder in the distance, Felix held his sister close and whispered promises that he finally believed he might be able to keep. They were going to be okay. They were going to be safe. And Vaughn was never going to hurt them again. The ambulance arrived first, its red and blue lights cutting through the darkness like beacons of hope. Felix had never been so grateful to see emergency vehicles in his life. The paramedics, AEE, woman with kind eyes and gentle hands, and a man who spoke in calm, reassuring tones, immediately took charge of the situation with the professional competence that Felix had only dreamed of experiencing. "My name is Sarah," the female paramedic said as she knelt beside Maple, "and this is my partner Mike. We're here to help you both, okay? You're safe now." Felix wanted to correct her about using his forbidden name list, but exhaustion and relief made speech difficult. Instead, he focused on the incredible sensation of having adults who were actually trying to help them rather than hurt them. Sarah's hands were gentle as she examined Maple's head injury, and her voice remained calm and professional, even as Felix could see the concern in her eyes. Mike was examining Felix's burned arm with the same careful attention, documenting the extent of the injury while preparing to provide immediate treatment. "This is a serious burn," he told Felix honestly. "We're going to take you to the hospital where doctors can treat it properly. You've been very brave." The word brave hit Felix like a physical blow. For months, he had felt like a failure for not being able to protect Maple completely, for not being able to stop Vaughn's abuse entirely. To have an adult recognize his courage and efforts was emotionally overwhelming. Police cars began arriving as the paramedics worked, their flashing lights adding to the surreal quality of the scene. Felix had been conditioned to fear authority figures, but these officers seemed different from his expectations. They moved with purpose but without aggression, focusing on securing the area and gathering information rather than making accusations or demands. Officer Ramona Sterling was the first to approach Felix directly. She was a woman in her early 40s with graying hair and eyes that suggested she had seen too much human suffering but hadn't lost her capacity for compassion. She knelt down to Felix's eye level, a gesture that immediately put him more at ease. "Felix," she said, having gotten his name from Donovan Hayes. "I'm Officer Sterling. I know this has been a terrible night for you and your sister, but I want you to know that you're both safe now. No one is going to hurt you anymore." Felix nodded, though part of him still couldn't quite believe that safety was possible. Months of living in constant fear had conditioned him to expect that any moment of peace would be followed by escalating violence. But Officer Sterling's presence was reassuring in a way that made him want to trust her. "The paramedics need to take you and Maple to the hospital," Officer Sterling continued. "But I'll be there too, and we'll need to talk about what happened to you. Is that okay?" Felix looked toward the ambulance where Maple was being loaded onto a small stretcher. Her eyes were closed, but the paramedics seemed to have her condition stabilized for transport. "Is she going to be okay?" Felix asked, his voice small and frightened. "The doctors at the hospital are going to take very good care of her," Officer Sterling said. "And they're going to take care of you too. But Felix, I need you to know that you did everything right tonight. You protected your sister, you got evidence of what was happening, and you got both of you to safety. You're a hero." The word hero was almost too much for Felix to process. He had spent so many months feeling powerless and afraid that being praised for his actions seemed surreal. But as he climbed into the ambulance next to Maple's stretcher, Felix allowed himself to feel a small spark of pride in what he had accomplished. The ride to Millbrook General Hospital took 20 minutes, during which the paramedics continued, monitoring both children's conditions while radioing ahead to prepare the emergency department for their arrival. Felix held Maple's hand during the transport, whispering reassurances that he hoped were true and watching her pale face for signs of consciousness. "She's stable," Sarah told Felix as they neared the hospital. "Her vital signs are good, and the doctors will be able to help her. You did the right thing getting her out of that house when you did." The emergency department was a controlled chaos of medical professionals preparing to receive them. Felix had never seen so many adults working together with the single goal of helping rather than harming, and the sight was both overwhelming and deeply comforting. Dr. Patricia Holloway met them at the ambulance bay, a woman in her 50s, with silver hair and the kind of confident demeanor that inspired immediate trust. She took one look at both children and began issuing orders that sent the medical team into coordinated action. "I want a full trauma workup on both children," Dr. Holloway said as they wheeled Maple toward an examination room. "CT scan for the head injury, full-body x-rays, and I want photographs of all visible injuries for documentation, and I want social services contacted immediately." Felix was separated from Maple as they were taken to different examination rooms, a separation that triggered his protective instincts despite his understanding that they both needed medical attention. A nurse named Janet, who had kind eyes and a grandmother's gentle manner, stayed with Felix while Dr. Holloway's team worked on Maple. "Your sister is in very good hands," Janet assured Felix, as she began the process of treating his burns and other injuries. "Dr. Holloway is one of the best pediatric emergency physicians in the state. She's going to take excellent care of Maple." The treatment of Felix's burns was painful but necessary. The fresh burn from Vaughn's heated spatula required debridement and specialized dressings, while his older scars needed to be documented and photographed as evidence of long-term abuse. Each injury told a story, and the medical team was methodically recording that story for the legal proceedings that would follow. "Felix," Janet said gently as she worked on his arm, "I need to ask you some questions about these older injuries. I know it might be difficult to talk about, but it's important that we understand what's been happening to you." Felix found it surprisingly easy to talk to Janet about the abuse. Maybe it was the relief of finally being believed, or maybe it was the pain medication they had given him. But the words came more easily than he had expected. He told her about the systematic nature of Vaughn's violence, about the basement room and its equipment, about his efforts to protect Maple and document their suffering. "You've been carrying a very heavy burden for a long time," Janet said when Felix finished speaking. "But you don't have to carry it alone anymore. There are people whose job it is to protect children, and they're going to make sure you and Maple are safe." Officer Sterling arrived at the hospital as Felix's treatment was being completed. She brought with her a social worker named Lydia Brennan, a woman in her late 30s who specialized in cases involving child abuse. Lydia had the kind of calm, reassuring presence that suggested she had helped many children through similar crises. "Felix," Lydia said as she introduced herself, "I'm here to help you and Maple navigate the next steps. I know everything feels overwhelming right now, but we're going to take things one step at a time, and you're going to have support through all of it." Felix learned that while he was being treated, Officer Sterling and her colleagues had gone to his house to arrest Vaughn. They had found him in a drunken rage, destroying furniture and screaming about ungrateful children who didn't appreciate his discipline. The basement room with its torture implements had provided all the evidence they needed to justify immediate arrest. "Vaughn Caldwell is in custody," Officer Sterling told Felix. "He's been charged with multiple counts of child abuse, assault with a deadly weapon, and unlawful imprisonment. The evidence you collected on that phone is going to help us make sure he never hurts another child." The smartphone with Felix's photographs had become a crucial piece of evidence. The images clearly showed not only the children's injuries, but also the systematic nature of the abuse, the basement torture chamber, the implements designed to inflict pain, and the pattern of escalating violence that had culminated in that night's near-fatal assault. "You were very smart to take those pictures," Officer Sterling continued. "Without that evidence, it would have been much harder to prove what was happening. You probably saved not only your own life and Maple's, but potentially the lives of other children who might have been Vaughn's victims in the future. Felix was allowed to see Maple once her initial treatment was completed. She was conscious but groggy, lying in a hospital bed that seemed to swallow her small frame. The sight of her hooked up to monitors and IV lines was frightening, but the steady beep of the heart monitor was reassuring proof that she was alive and stable. "Felix?" Maple's voice was weak but recognizable. "Are we safe now?" "Yes, sweetheart," Felix said, taking her hand carefully to avoid the IV line. "We're safe. The doctors are taking care of us, and Vaughn can't hurt us anymore." Dr. Holloway joined them to explain Maple's condition. "She has a concussion and some swelling in her brain from the impact with the wall," the doctor said. "We're going to keep her here for observation for a few days to make sure the swelling goes down and—" "There are no complications, but her prognosis is good. Children's brains are remarkably resilient, and we expect her to make a full recovery." The news about Maple's prognosis was the first genuinely good news Felix had received in months. The fear that his sister might suffer permanent brain damage had been his greatest terror during their escape, and knowing that she would recover completely lifted a weight from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. Felix's own injuries required ongoing treatment but were not life-threatening. His burns would heal, though they would likely leave additional scars to add to his collection. The cuts from the broken glass and wire mesh were superficial and would heal quickly. More importantly, the emotional trauma that both children had suffered would require long-term counseling and support. "Both of you are going to need time to heal, not just physically but emotionally," Lydia explained to Felix. "What you've been through is called trauma, and it affects how your brain and body respond to stress. But there are people who specialize in helping children recover from trauma, and you're going to have access to all the support you need." The question of where Felix and Maple would live while they recovered was addressed with the same systematic care that had characterized their medical treatment. Lydia explained that they would be placed in a specialized foster home with people who were trained to care for children who had experienced severe abuse. "The Anderson family has been working with traumatized children for over 10 years, Lydia said. "They understand what you've been through, and they know how to help children feel safe again. You'll have your own rooms, access to counseling, and all the time you need to heal." Felix felt a complex mix of emotions about leaving the only home he had ever known, even though that home had become a place of terror. There was something fundamentally disorienting about the idea of living with strangers, even kind strangers, who wanted to help them. But the alternative, returning to a house where they had experienced so much suffering, was unthinkable. "What about our mum?" Felix asked, the question that had been weighing on his mind since their rescue. Celeste had been noticeably absent from the hospital, and Felix was confused and hurt by her failure to appear during their crisis. Lydia's expression became more serious. "Your mother is also at the hospital, but she's being treated for her own injuries. Vaughn hurt her badly when he realized you had escaped, and she's going to need time to recover too. But Felix, I need you to understand that your mother is also going to have to answer some difficult questions about why she didn't protect you and Maple from the abuse." This information was difficult for Felix to process. On one hand, he was relieved to know that his mother was alive and receiving medical care. On the other hand, he was struggling with complicated feelings about her failure to protect them from Vaughn's violence. Love and disappointment could coexist, Felix was learning, and both emotions could be equally powerful. "Will we see her?" Felix asked. "Eventually, yes," Lydia said. "But right now, the focus needs to be on your recovery and healing. Your relationship with your mother is something that will be addressed over time, with the help of counselors who understand family dynamics in abuse situations." The next few hours were a blur of medical procedures, police interviews, and social services paperwork. Felix found himself repeating his story multiple times to different professionals, each of whom needed specific information for their role in the investigation and care planning. The attention was overwhelming after months of being invisible to the adults who should have been protecting them. Officer Sterling conducted a formal interview with Felix, recording his statement about the abuse and the events leading up to their escape. Felix was surprised by how much detail he was able to recall, how clearly he could describe the systematic nature of Vaughn's violence and the specific incidents that had escalated over time. "You're an excellent witness," Officer Sterling told Felix after the interview. "Your ability to remember details and explain what happened is going to be very important for the prosecution. Vaughn is going to face serious charges, and your testimony will help ensure that he's held accountable for what he did to you and Maple." The idea that his words might have power in a courtroom was both empowering and frightening for Felix. For so long, nothing he said had mattered to the adults around him. But now, his voice would be heard by judges and juries who had the power to ensure that Vaughn faced consequences for his actions. As the night stretched into early morning, Felix found himself experiencing a strange combination of exhaustion and hypervigilance. His body was desperately tired from the trauma and medical treatment, but his mind remained alert for signs of danger that his rational brain knew were no longer present. The hospital staff explained that this was a normal response to trauma, and that his nervous system would need time to readjust to safety. "It's going to take time for your body to understand that you're safe now," Janet explained as she checked on Felix's bandages. "You've been in survival mode for so long that relaxing feels scary, but that's normal, and it will get better with time and support." Felix was finally allowed to sleep around 4 in the morning in a hospital bed next to Maple's room so he could be close to his sister while still receiving the medical monitoring he needed. The bed was more comfortable than anything he had slept in for months, and the knowledge that there were adults nearby whose job it was to protect him allowed Felix to experience something approaching peaceful rest. But even in sleep, Felix's mind remained partially alert for sounds of danger. He woke several times during the night, momentarily confused about where he was before remembering that they were safe in the hospital. Each time, he would look through the doorway to Maple's room to confirm that she was still there, and still breathing, the protective instincts that had kept them alive still operating even in safety. Morning brought a parade of new faces, doctors checking on their recovery, social workers explaining next steps, and child psychologists beginning the process of assessing their emotional needs. Felix was overwhelmed by the number of adults who were suddenly invested in their welfare, a stark contrast to the months of being ignored and dismissed. Dr. Holloway arrived during morning rounds with encouraging news about Maple's condition. The swelling in her brain had decreased overnight, and her neurological responses were all within normal ranges. She would need to stay in the hospital for a few more days for observation, but her recovery was proceeding exactly as they had hoped. "She's going to be fine," Dr. Holloway told Felix with a smile. "Her brain is healing beautifully, and we don't expect any long-term effects from the injury. You got her help just in time." The news about Maple's complete recovery was the final piece Felix needed to begin believing that their nightmare was truly over. For months, his greatest fear had been that his failure to protect Maple would result in permanent harm to his sister. Knowing that she would recover completely allowed Felix to finally begin processing his own trauma rather than focusing entirely on her welfare. Lydia Brennan returned later that morning with information about the Anderson family and the transition to their foster home. She brought photographs of the house where Felix and Maple would be living, and information about the family members who would be caring for them. "Robert and Patricia Anderson have been fostering children for 15 years, Lydia explained. "They specialize in caring for children who have experienced trauma, and they understand that recovery is a process that takes time. They have 2 other foster children right now, teenagers who have been with them for over a year and are doing very well." The photographs showed a comfortable, well-maintained house with separate bedrooms for Felix and Maple, a large backyard with play equipment, and common areas that looked warm and welcoming. It was the kind of home Felix had dreamed of during the worst moments of their abuse, the kind of place where children could feel safe and valued. "When will we go there?" Felix asked. "Probably tomorrow or the next day, once Maple is discharged from the hospital," Lydia said. "The Andersons are looking forward to meeting you both. and they want you to know that you can stay with them for as long as you need. There's no pressure and no timeline. You'll move at your own pace. Felix felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety about meeting their foster family. After months of living with adults who posed a constant threat, the idea of trusting new caregivers felt both appealing and terrifying. But the alternative, remaining in the system indefinitely, was even less appealing. That afternoon, Felix was allowed to walk around the hospital and visit other parts of the children's wing. The simple freedom to move without fear of punishment was intoxicating, and Felix found himself marveling at things that most children took for granted. Nurses who smiled when they saw him, other children playing without constant supervision, adults who spoke to him with kindness rather than anger. In the hospital's children's playroom, Felix encountered other young patients and began to understand that he and Maple were not the only children who had experienced trauma and abuse. There were other children with suspicious injuries, other families dealing with the aftermath of violence, other stories of survival and recovery. "It's not your fault, you know," said a girl who appeared to be about Felix's age and was recovering from her own traumatic experience. "Whatever happened to you, it wasn't because you did anything wrong." The simple statement hit Felix with unexpected force. For months, he had carried the burden of believing that somehow, if he had been better or smarter or stronger, he could have prevented Vaughn's abuse entirely. The idea that he was not responsible for the violence inflicted upon him was both liberating and difficult to accept. As evening approached, Felix was surprised by a visit from Donovan Hayes, the man who had stopped to help them on the road and called for emergency assistance. Donovan brought flowers for Maple and a small toy truck for Felix, gestures of kindness that seemed almost overwhelming in their simple generosity. "I wanted to check on you both and see how you're doing," Donovan said. "What you did that night, protecting your sister and getting evidence of the abuse, was incredibly brave. You saved both your lives." Donovan's visit reinforced for Felix that there were good adults in the world, people who would help children in need without expecting anything in return. After months of experiencing only adults who posed threats, meeting someone like Donovan was profoundly healing. "Will you testify in court?" Felix asked Donovan, curious about how the legal process would unfold. "Yes, I'll testify about finding you that night and seeing the evidence on your phone," Donovan said. "But the most important testimony will come from you and the medical professionals who documented your injuries. Your voice is the one that matters most in making sure Vaughn faces consequences for what he did." As Felix prepared for his second night in the hospital, he reflected on the extraordinary changes that had occurred in less than 24 hours. Yesterday at this time, he had been a powerless victim, trapped in a basement torture chamber with his dying sister. Today, he was a survivor receiving medical care and protection, with a plan for recovery and a future that held possibility rather than fear. The transformation seemed almost too dramatic to be real, and Felix found himself wondering if he might wake up to discover that safety was just another dream. But the steady presence of medical monitors, the gentle care of hospital staff, and the sight of Maple sleeping peacefully in the next room provided concrete evidence that their rescue was real and lasting. "Tomorrow, we start the next chapter," Felix whispered to Maple as he settled into his hospital bed for the night. "And this one is going to have a happy ending." For the first time in months, Felix fell asleep without fear, surrounded by adults whose job it was to protect him rather than harm him. The nightmares would come later, as trauma often manifests, in delayed responses. But for now, he slept the deep sleep of a child who finally felt safe. 9 months after that terrible night in Vaughn's basement, Felix Whitman stood in front of a mirror in his bedroom at the Anderson house, examining the scars on his arms that had become part of his personal landscape. The burns had healed into raised pink marks that would likely fade over time, but never completely disappear. Felix had learned to see these scars not as marks of shame, but as evidence of his survival and strength. The bedroom that Felix now called his own was everything he had dreamed of during the darkest moments of their abuse. The walls were painted, a calming blue color that Felix had chosen himself, and the furniture was sturdy and comfortable without being ostentatious. There were bookshelves filled with age-appropriate novels and reference books, a desk where Felix could do homework without fear of interruption, and a window that looked out onto the large backyard where Maple often played with their foster siblings. Robert and Patricia Anderson had proven to be the kind of foster parents that social workers dream about finding for traumatized children. Robert was a retired teacher who had dedicated his later years to caring for children who had experienced the worst that life could offer, while Patricia was a nurse who understood both the physical and emotional healing that abuse survivors required. They had welcomed Felix and Maple into their home with the patience and understanding that had allowed both children to begin the slow process of learning to trust adults again. The house itself felt like a sanctuary after the nightmare of their previous home. It was a two-story colonial with 4 bedrooms, large common areas that encouraged family interaction, and multiple spaces where children could retreat when they needed solitude. The kitchen was always stocked with healthy food, and mealtimes were calm, pleasant affairs where children were encouraged to try new foods, but never forced to clean their plates or eat things that made them uncomfortable. Felix had his own bedroom, for the first time in his life, a space that was entirely his own, where he could process his experiences and emotions without having to constantly monitor Maple's safety or Vaughn's moods. The privacy had been overwhelming at first. Felix had spent so many months in hypervigilant protective mode that relaxing alone in his room felt almost forbidden. But gradually, with the support of his therapists and foster family, he had learned to enjoy solitude and personal space. Maple's recovery had been remarkable to witness. At 4 years old, she had demonstrated the resilience that children often show in the face of trauma, bouncing back from her physical injuries with surprising speed while working through the emotional impact of their abuse with the help of specialized play therapy. Her room was next to Felix's, decorated in bright yellows and greens that reflected her naturally sunny personality, which had slowly re-emerged as she learned to feel safe again. The most significant change in Maple was her return to age-appropriate behavior. She played with toys without obsessive carefulness, spoke in a normal volume rather than the whispers that had become her default during their time with Vaughn, and most importantly, she had learned to trust that the adults in her life would protect her rather than hurt her. She still had nightmares occasionally, and certain sounds or situations could trigger anxiety responses, but overall her recovery had exceeded everyone's most optimistic expectations. Felix's own healing had been more complex and gradual. At 9 years old now, he had spent a significant portion of his childhood in survival mode, and learning to be a normal child rather than a protector and caretaker required conscious effort and ongoing support. Individual therapy with Dr. Margaret Chen had helped Felix process his trauma, while family therapy sessions had taught all the Anderson household members how to support each other's healing. Dr. Chen had explained to Felix that his hyper-responsibility for Maple's safety was a common response to childhood trauma, but that learning to share that responsibility with trustworthy adults was an important part of his recovery. "You can still be a loving big brother without carrying the entire weight of keeping Maple safe," Dr. Chen had told him. "Other people can help you protect the people you love." The concept of shared responsibility had been revolutionary for Felix. For so long he had believed that if anything bad happened to Maple, it would be entirely his fault for not preventing it. Learning that safety was a community responsibility rather than his individual burden had lifted a weight from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. School had initially been challenging for Felix, who had missed significant amounts of education during the worst period of Vaughn's abuse. The trauma had also affected his ability to concentrate and retain information, common side effects that required patience and specialized educational support. But Millbrook Elementary School had a program specifically designed for children who had experienced trauma, and Felix's teachers understood that his healing was more important than catching up on missed curriculum. Mr. David Torres, Felix's current teacher, had become an important figure in his recovery. Mr. Torres had experience working with children from difficult backgrounds, and he had created a classroom environment where Felix felt safe to learn and make mistakes without fear of punishment. When Felix had panic attacks triggered by loud noises or unexpected movements, Mr. Torres knew how to provide support without drawing unwanted attention from other students. Felix has made incredible progress this year, Mr. Torres had told the Andersons during a recent parent conference. His academic skills are nearly caught up to grade level, but more importantly, he's learning to trust himself and his abilities. He's becoming confident in expressing his thoughts and asking for help when he needs it. The legal proceedings against Vaughn had concluded 3 months earlier with a conviction that exceeded even the prosecutor's expectations. Vaughn Caldwell had been sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole, based largely on the photographic evidence that Felix had courageously gathered and his compelling testimony about the systematic nature of the abuse. Felix had testified in court via closed-circuit television, an accommodation that allowed him to tell his story without being in the same room as Vaughn. The experience had been frightening, but ultimately empowering, as Felix realized that his voice had power and that adults in positions of authority were finally listening to him and believing his account of what had happened. "Your testimony made the difference in this case," District Attorney Michelle Rodriguez had told Felix after the sentencing. "Your courage in documenting the abuse and speaking out about what happened has not only brought justice for you and Maple, but it's also ensured that Vaughn will never hurt another child. You should be very proud of what you've accomplished." The trial had also brought closure regarding their mother's situation. Celeste Whitman Caldwell had been charged with child endangerment for her failure to protect Felix and Maple from Vaughn's abuse, but she had received a suspended sentence in exchange for her cooperation with the prosecution and her commitment to intensive therapy and parenting classes. Felix's relationship with his mother remained complicated and was being addressed through supervised visits and family counseling. Celeste was living in a women's shelter while working to rebuild her life and address the psychological trauma that had made her unable to protect her children. The visits were awkward and emotional, filled with apologies that Felix wasn't sure he was ready to accept and promises that he wasn't sure he could trust. "Your mother loves you very much," Patricia Anderson had explained to Felix after a particularly difficult visit. "But love isn't always enough to protect children if the adult is too damaged or frightened to act. Your mother failed to protect you, and that's not okay, even though she was also being hurt. It's possible to love someone and still be angry with them for letting you down." The concept that love and disappointment could coexist had been a recurring theme in Felix's therapy. Dr. Chen had helped him understand that his complex feelings toward his mother were normal and healthy, and that he didn't have to choose between forgiving her completely or cutting her out of his life entirely. Their relationship could be rebuilt slowly, with appropriate safeguards and support, if that's what Felix ultimately wanted. Maple's relationship with their mother was less complicated, partly because of her younger age when the abuse occurred, and partly because she had been less aware of Celeste's failures to intervene. Maple looked forward to their supervised visits and often made drawings or crafts to share with their mother, approaching the relationship with the innocent optimism of a 5-year-old who wanted to believe that adults could change and improve. The impact of their case had extended beyond their own family. The photographs Felix had taken of Vaughn's basement torture chamber had been used in training programs for social workers, police officers, and medical professionals to help them recognize signs of systematic child abuse. Felix's story had also contributed to changes in local protocols for investigating suspected abuse cases, ensuring that children's reports would be taken more seriously and investigated more thoroughly. "What you went through was terrible, officer," Ramona Sterling had told Felix during a follow-up visit. "But your courage in speaking out has helped create changes that will protect other children. That's an incredible legacy for someone your age to have created." Felix had mixed feelings about being seen as a symbol or spokesperson for child abuse survivors. While he was proud that his experience might help other children, he also wanted to be seen as more than just a victim or survivor. He wanted to be recognized as a normal kid who happened to have experienced extraordinary circumstances rather than being defined entirely by his trauma. This desire for normalcy had led to Felix becoming involved in activities that had nothing to do with his abuse experience. He had joined the school's chess club, where his strategic thinking and ability to plan several moves ahead made him a formidable opponent. He had also discovered a talent for drawing and painting, using art as both a therapeutic outlet and a way to express aspects of his personality that had nothing to do with survival or protection. Maple had similarly blossomed in activities that allowed her to be a normal 5-year-old. She had joined a local ballet class where she could express herself through movement and music, and she had made friends with other children in her kindergarten class who knew nothing about her background and simply accepted her as a fun playmate. Watching Maple laugh and play without fear had become one of Felix's greatest sources of joy. The Anderson family had also provided Felix and Maple with positive role models in the form of their other foster children. Maria, a 16-year-old who had been with the Andersons for 2 years, had become like an older sister to both younger children. She had her own history of trauma and abuse, but she had made remarkable progress in her recovery and was planning to attend college the following year with the Andersons' support. "The most important thing I learned," Maria had told Felix during one of their conversations, "is that what happened to us doesn't define who we are or what we can become. We're survivors, but we're also so much more than that. We get to decide who we want to be going forward." Jason, a 14-year-old who had been with the Andersons for 6 months, was still in the earlier stages of his recovery, but was making steady progress. Having other children in the house who understood trauma and healing had created a supportive environment where everyone's struggles were acknowledged and respected without becoming the sole focus of family life. Felix had recently made a decision that represented a significant milestone in his recovery. He had volunteered to participate in a community presentation about recognizing and preventing child abuse, sharing appropriate parts of his story with an audience of teachers, healthcare workers, and community leaders. The presentation was scheduled for the following week, and Felix was both nervous and excited about the opportunity to use his experience to help protect other children. "I want to tell them that children usually tell the truth about abuse," Felix had explained to Dr. Chen when discussing his decision to speak publicly. "And I want them to know that even when children can't tell someone directly, they might leave clues or evidence that adults need to pay attention to. If one teacher or doctor listens more carefully because of what I say, maybe another kid won't have to go through what Maple and I did." The presentation would mark the first time Felix had spoken publicly about his experiences outside of the legal proceedings. It represented a choice to transform his trauma into advocacy, to use his voice not just for his own healing, but to potentially prevent other children from experiencing similar abuse. Patricia Anderson had been particularly supportive of Felix's decision to speak publicly. As a nurse, she understood the importance of education in preventing child abuse, and she was proud of Felix's courage in choosing to share his story for the benefit of others. "Not every survivor chooses to speak out," Patricia had told Felix, "and that's perfectly okay. But when someone with your strength and articulation decides to use their voice to help others, it can make a real difference in the world." The morning of Felix's presentation dawned bright and clear, and he woke up feeling nervous but determined. He had practiced his remarks with Dr. Chen and the Andersons, focusing on age-appropriate ways to describe his experiences while emphasizing the importance of believing children and taking their reports seriously. Maple had made him a good luck card the night before, decorated with rainbows and hearts and a message that read, "You are the best big brother and very brave." Felix kept the card in his pocket as he prepared for the presentation, a tangible reminder of why his advocacy work mattered. The presentation was held at the Millbrook Community Center in a large room filled with adults whose work brought them into contact with children. Felix saw teachers from his school, nurses from the hospital where he and Maple had been treated, police officers including Officer Sterling, and social workers including Lydia Brennan. The audience was diverse but unified in their commitment to protecting children. Felix took the stage with Dr. Chen beside him for support, looking out at the faces of adults who had chosen to spend their Saturday morning learning about child protection. For a moment, he felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of representing not just his own experience, but the experiences of all children who had suffered in silence. "My name is Felix Whitman," he began, his voice stronger than he had expected it to be. "When I was 8 years old, my sister Maple and I were being hurt by our stepfather, and we couldn't find any adults who would listen to us or help us. Today, I want to tell you how children ask for help and how adults can recognize when kids are in danger." Felix's presentation lasted 20 minutes and covered the warning signs he had displayed that adults had missed, the ways children might try to communicate about abuse without using direct words, and the importance of believing children even when their stories seemed unlikely or disturbing. He spoke about the photographs he had taken as evidence, emphasizing that children often found creative ways to document their experiences when they couldn't find adults to tell. "The most important thing I want you to remember," Felix concluded, "is that kids usually tell the truth about scary things that happen to them. Even if their story seems hard to believe, even if the adult who's hurting them seems nice to everyone else, children don't usually make up stories about being hurt. When a kid tries to tell you something bad is happening, please listen to them and help them find safety." The audience responded with a standing ovation that brought tears to Felix's eyes. After months of feeling like his voice didn't matter, being applauded by a room full of adults who worked to protect children was profoundly validating. Several audience members approached him after the presentation to thank him for his courage and to share how his words would influence their practice. Dr. Patricia Holloway, who had treated Felix and Maple in the emergency room, was among those who spoke with Felix after his presentation. "You've grown into such a remarkable young man," she told him. "Your courage that night saved your life and Maple's. But your courage today might save the lives of children we haven't even met yet." The drive home from the presentation was quiet, with Felix processing the emotions of having shared his story publicly, while the Andersons respected his need for reflection. When they arrived home, Maple was waiting with a homemade banner that read, "Welcome Home Hero," and the family celebrated Felix's accomplishment with his favorite dinner and a cake that Patricia had baked specially for the occasion. That evening, as Felix was getting ready for bed, he found himself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought him from that terrified 8-year-old in Vaughn's basement to a confident 9-year-old who could speak publicly about his experiences to help other children. The transformation seemed almost impossible to believe, but the evidence was all around him, in his comfortable bedroom, in Maple's healthy laughter, in the caring adults who now surrounded them with protection and support. Felix walked to Maple's room to say goodnight, a ritual that had evolved from his old protective vigilance into a simple expression of brotherly love. Maple was already in her pajamas, brushing her teeth with the independence that 5-year-olds cherish, but she still liked having Felix tuck her in and read her a short story before sleep. "Felix," Maple said, as he settled into the chair beside her bed with a picture book, "are we going to live here forever?" It was a question that came up periodically, reflecting Maple's need for reassurance about the permanence of their safety. The Andersons had made it clear that Felix and Maple could stay with them for as long as they needed, whether that meant until they aged out of the system or until they could safely reunite with their mother. But Felix understood why Maple needed repeated confirmation. "We're going to live here until we don't need to anymore," Felix said, the answer he had learned from their therapists. "The Andersons promise to take care of us for as long as we need them to, and they keep their promises. But even if we lived somewhere else someday, we would still be safe because we know how to ask for help now, and there are lots of adults whose job it is to protect children." Maple nodded solemnly, satisfied with this answer, as she had been many times before. Felix read her a story about a brave little mouse who went on adventures but always found her way home safely, a theme that resonated with both children's experiences of survival and recovery. After Maple had fallen asleep, Felix returned to his own room and prepared for bed with the comfortable routine that had replaced the hypervigilant preparations that had once been necessary for survival. He no longer checked and rechecked locks, no longer listened for sounds of approaching danger, no longer slept with one ear alert for signs that Maple was in distress. As Felix settled into bed, he thought about the presentation earlier that day, and the adults who had listened to his story with such attention and respect. He thought about the changes that had occurred in his life and Maple's, the healing they had both experienced, and the future that now stretched ahead of them filled with possibility rather than fear. Felix had learned that healing from trauma was not a linear process, that there would always be difficult days and setbacks along with the progress and growth.
But he had also learned that resilience was possible, that children could survive terrible experiences and still grow up to be healthy, happy adults with the right support and care. The scars on Felix's arms would always be visible reminders of
what he and Maple had endured, but they had also become symbols of their strength and survival. Felix touched the raised skin gently, remembering the pain those burns had caused, but also remembering the courage he had found in the face of that pain. "We made it," Felix whispered into the darkness of his safe, comfortable bedroom. "We're okay, and we're going to stay okay." Outside his window, the lights of Millbrook twinkled peacefully, and Felix could hear the gentle sounds of a neighborhood where children could play safely and families could live without fear. It was the kind of normalcy that Felix had once thought might be impossible for him and Maple to achieve. But now he understood that healing could create new possibilities even after the worst experiences. Felix fell asleep that night with a sense of peace and accomplishment that would have seemed impossible 9 months earlier. He had not only survived Vaughn's abuse and saved Maple's life, but he had transformed his experience into advocacy that might protect other children. He had learned to trust adults again, to accept help and support, and to believe in his own worth and capabilities. Most importantly, Felix had learned that the love between him and Maple was strong enough to overcome even the worst trauma, and that their bond as siblings would continue to be a source of strength and joy as they grew up together in safety. The nightmare was over, and their real life, the life they deserved to have always had, was finally beginning. In the bed next to his room, Maple slept peacefully, her dreams filled with ballet recitals and playground adventures rather than the terrors that had once haunted her nights. And in the living room downstairs, Robert and Patricia Anderson sat together reviewing the positive reports from Felix's teachers and therapists, proud of the progress both children had made and committed to supporting their continued healing, for as long as they needed. The house was quiet and safe, filled with the kind of peace that comes when children are truly protected and loved. And for the first time in their lives, Felix and Maple were simply children, not victims, not survivors, but children who could dream about their futures without fear and wake up each morning knowing that they were safe, valued, and home.